So we are starting a new series for the next 5 weeks on the book of Deuteronomy. And the book of Deuteronomy, little pop quiz, which book of the Bible is it? How many books in?
5.
Yes, well done. Who wrote it? Moses, well done. 5th book, Moses wrote it. And does anyone know what it means? Yes, the second law, which leads me quickly to what is the first law? So we're going to jump back a bit before Deuteronomy. So Deuteronomy is the 5th book, the final book of what we call the Torah, which is the book of the law given to Israel. Now, the first law began with the 10 Commandments, but if we go back a bit from there again, the people of Israel, Pharaoh started to become very concerned about them. And so he decided to oppress them and make them into slaves. And so for a long time, Israel was living as slaves in Egypt. And then there's all the miraculous stories of how God brought them through away from that. So there's a whole bunch of plagues, and there's the Red Sea, the parting of the Red Sea, and as God takes the people through, he then brings the seas back onto Pharaoh's army, which is alluded to a little bit in our reading today. And these people are on their way to the promised land. And this is land that God has told them they would live in. Land in those days was especially important. It's still important now, but you lived off the land. Your entire livelihood was based on the land. So having the promised land, a fruitful land that is set aside for your people, was an incredible blessing. And so they are taken, and firstly they go to Mount Sinai. And Mount Sinai is where Moses meets with God, and these are a people who have been oppressed for so long, they don't know how to live as a freed people. And so Moses gives them the first law, or God gives them the first law through Moses. It begins with the 10 Commandments. Now, another pop quiz, what is Commandment 1? Love the Lord your God, well done. Commandment 2? No other idols, well done, just the first 2. And thankfully, it's all right, you can rest. Now, after Moses went up on the mountain and he came down and he brought them the 10 Commandments, and then he went back on the mountain and he was having these discussions with God as God is giving him all of these laws and all of these commands for his people. In the meantime, the people make a golden calf to worship. Now, they have instantly broken the first 2 commands that God has given them. They made an idol, they had a god before God, and they worshipped the idol. Now, there are 613 commands throughout this whole section, beginning with the 10 Commandments. And so when we look at that first part on the screen here, the law, basically what happened is God gave a bit of that, or Moses portrayed a bit of what the law was, and then the people failed. So then they were given a few more laws to say, okay, well, let's give it another go. Here are some more laws. And then they broke those. And then they were given more. And then they failed. And they were given more. And they failed over and over and over again until we come to the edge of the promised land. So they've been wandering in the desert for 40 years. They are now at the edge of the promised land. And God has said to them, all right, here's the promised land. I'm going to give it to you. Go and take it. So that's where we are. Moses is now giving them a second law in Deuteronomy. And what he's doing is he's reframing that first law. So the first law wasn't bad or wrong or anything. It's just that this is a new group of people. This is a new generation who didn't grow up with that law because they were still complaining and still disobeying God, even in the wilderness, that God said, none of you are going to go forward except for Caleb. And it was Caleb because he followed God wholeheartedly. And so what Moses is doing is reframing the law for this new group of people. Now, this happens in the New Testament as well. So Paul says, for it is written in the law of Moses, do not muzzle an ox while it is treading out the grain. So that's a law from Moses, and Paul's talking about this in Romans. Is it about oxen that God is concerned? Surely he says this for us, doesn't he? Yes, this was written for us because whoever plows and threshes should be able to do so in the hope of sharing the harvest. So time after time, what God does is he doesn't abolish laws or rules or commands. He reframes them for a new people. But ultimately, what's underneath all of this is the heart of the law. Now, the heart of the law is to love God and love others. We've heard Jesus talk about this. When they say that Jesus fulfills the law, what he's meaning is that we failed, clearly, over and over again. We still fail now. I mean, some of the laws were things like we're not meant to wear more than one type of fabric. So I can pretty much guarantee we've all broken that one today. But the heart of that law was that we would be devoted and wholeheartedly focused on one thing, on God. The heart of it was to try and direct us in the right way, to have a single focus. And so with all of these laws, the heart of them is ultimately to love God and to love others. A couple of stories for you. When I was a child, so I have a sister who is 5 years older than me, and when I was about sort of 9-ish, bit of an annoying wee kid, and my sister was a surly 14-year-old by that point, she had a rule for me that I wasn't allowed in her room. And so that's fine, all good. What I would do is I'd open her door and I would stand at the edge of her room and I would sing loudly and I would chat to her and I would do all sorts of things, and she would yell at me, "Get out!" And I would say, "Not in your room." And it was great, worked very well. I had a recorder that I used to annoy her with, and she hid it for 2 years, and it was great. But that is an example of missing the heart of the law. She was often on the phone at the time, chatting to her friends, very important for a 14-year-old, and so I missed the point of the heart of that rule was that she needed some privacy. But instead, I wanted her attention and all of this. Another example, perhaps slightly more serious example, is from AOM houses. And in AOM houses, we had a rule that there was to be no alcohol in the house. Now, it was quite a black and white rule, no alcohol crossing the doorway. In fact, there was some debate as to whether it included cars or that kind of thing as well. But in general, no alcohol on the property. Now, the purpose of that, the heart of the law, is that these AOM houses, so these were houses of youth workers who lived together, and they were meant to be houses of hospitality for young people. And so having alcohol in a house where young people are frequently coming through is not particularly conducive to loving the young people, particularly if they're vulnerable young people, maybe their family doesn't have a particularly good history with alcohol. It's just much easier if it's not there and it's not a temptation. Also, the heart of that rule is that if we as leaders are drunk, that is not conducive to loving our young people. What happens if they turn up suddenly? What happens if we do things that we're not in control of? All these things. It's not conducive with loving others. The heart of the rule is good. But you can imagine that when you have 18-year-olds, and not just 18-year-olds, but some 18-year-olds who come into houses, they're just legally allowed to drink, and suddenly they're not allowed it in their house. It's quite disappointing. It's quite hard. And so for some of them in particular, we needed to have that hard and fast rule so that the heart was able to be there. Now, I think it's a little like that with what God is doing with Israel. Israel couldn't quite hold the heart of it, and therefore it had to be a harder rule. And so we look at some of these laws from the first 5 books of the Bible and we think, ooh, that's quite full on. But the purpose of them was so that the people would be able to hold the heart. Now, they didn't do very well at that, but ultimately, Jesus is our perfect example of loving God and loving others. And it brings us to our reading today. So from Deuteronomy chapter 1. What happened with the Israelites is that they are told, as we come up to it, basically they're told that God is giving them the land. There we go. See, the Lord your God has given you the land. Go up and take possession of it as the Lord, the God of your ancestors, told you. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged. They're told to go for it. However, what do they say? They say, let us send men ahead to spy out the land for us. And then funnily enough, the men go and do that, and they say, oh, it's a good land that the Lord our God is giving us. Well, yeah, it is. God wants to give good things. The purpose is for these people to be blessed, to be a blessing to others. And so they send these spies out, but then Moses says, you rebelled against the command of the Lord your God. They didn't trust that God would be with them as they went into the promised land. They grumbled. But when they went out and they saw the people that were in the promised land, that God said, just go in and you can take it, they said, the people are stronger and taller than we are. Stronger and taller than God? They had missed the heart of this. They had missed that God had always gone ahead of them. God had made these promises. God is faithful. And they had failed in following that. And so, as they went forward, Moses said to them, you saw how the Lord your God carried you as a father carries his son. But then he says, no one from this evil generation shall see the good land I swore to give your ancestors, except Caleb, because he followed the Lord wholeheartedly. But then that brings us to our second part. So we've talked about the law, we've talked about what it means, about ultimately this is a reframing of the same heart of the law. But there's the second part, which is covenant. And covenant is like a deep promise. And in these cases, it's between God and us. And already before we get to this point in Deuteronomy, there have been at least 3 covenants. There's been one with Noah, God with Noah, where he said, I won't send a flood again, but instead you will obey and be my people, and I will be your God, and we'll start this again. And then there's the one with Abraham, where God says, your descendants will be as numerous as the stars, and I will bless you, the nation of Israel, so that one day you will be a blessing to the rest of the world. And then there's the one with Moses, where God says to him, I am making your people into a kingdom of priests. And again, a kingdom of priests is about being set apart, being different, but for the purpose of blessing the nations. And ultimately, we know that God is a faithful God, and that God will always uphold his part of that covenant. But we struggle. And so we jump forward. We live post-Jesus' death and resurrection. And Jesus set out a new covenant that Jesus would show us perfectly how to love God and how to love others, and that Jesus would actually take us along that journey with him and send the Spirit, so that instead of us having to be obedient to these rules and these laws and commands that we will always fail, we can rely on Jesus and the Spirit within us, and we can be obedient to the Spirit. And because of that, it means that Jesus will make up for our shortcomings, and Jesus will hold us, and therefore we can be in that right relationship with God. And so there's another reading here about the vine and the branches, and I think this is a good example of the covenant. So you may have heard about the vine. Jesus is the vine, and we are the branches, and we are grafted into that. And we know that because we're grafted into Jesus, we can hold on to his ability to perfectly follow these laws. And it says, if you remain in me and I in you, you will bear much fruit. As the Father has loved me, so have I loved you. Now remain in my love. But then we come to this really awkward part. So love each other as I have loved you. You are my friends if you do what I command. Doesn't quite sound like friendship, does it? And so I think if we read this primarily by rules, then we think, okay, so we have to do what Jesus commands, otherwise we're not his friends. But what is what he commands? At the end of this passage, this is my command, love each other. That then makes quite a lot of logical sense. If you're loving each other, then we're friends. If we're not loving each other, naturally we are not Jesus' friends. We are not obeying him. We're not following what he's doing. Jesus is not calling us to live by all of these specific strict rules. He's calling us back to the heart of the law, which is to love God and to love others. There's another passage just before that. That's in John 15. There's another passage in John 14 where Jesus talks about a similar kind of concept. But I'd like you to see a bit of a theme through here. If you love me, keep my commands. If we skip forward a little bit, what else does it say? Whoever has my commands and keeps them is the one who loves me. Anyone who loves me will obey my teaching. This is all in a very short passage. Anyone who does not love me will not obey my teaching. And so ultimately, there's a bit of a theme through here. I think there's one more at the end. I love the Father and do exactly what my Father has commanded me. The theme here throughout all of this is obedience. Obedience used to be to the law, but now obedience is to the Spirit. So if we hold the heart of the law and the heart of what God was saying through Moses in Deuteronomy to the people of Israel, if we hold that for ourselves, it means that we are to love God, we are to love others, but we have the Spirit within us to help us with that. It doesn't have to be a stressful thing that we get right or we don't get right, but instead we learn to listen to the alive and real Spirit of God that is within us. We learn to recognize its promptings. We learn that the Spirit can tell us what words to say or prompt us of who to talk to, prompt us to shut our mouths at times and whether that might be helpful. But ultimately, the Spirit guides us through all of this. So we can learn a lot from the passage in Deuteronomy, or the book of Deuteronomy. We can learn a lot through the law. But ultimately, this is reframed for us as we live by the Spirit. And so I'd really encourage you to spend a few minutes, we'll reflect on that now. Reflect on what the Spirit might be prompting you to do or not do, or say or not say at the moment. Is there something in your life where you've lost sight of the heart of the rule or the command or the law? Is there something within your faith that you know that there's a rule, but you don't know why? Do you view God as a judge or a policeman? What might the Spirit be saying to you instead?